Enjoying the $5,000 a month, Mom? My son asked with a warm smile as he wrapped his arms around me at the Christmas party, his voice light, almost playful, as if he had just asked whether I liked the eggnog or the music, but something in the way he said it made my chest tighten, because I had no idea what he was talking about, and for a brief second, I wondered if I had misheard him over the soft hum of holiday chatter and the distant sound of a piano playing carols in the corner of the grand living room. But when I pulled back and looked into Ryan's face, I saw expectation there, genuine and unguarded, the kind of look a son gives his mother when he believes he's done something good for her, something meaningful, and that was when I knew I hadn't misheard anything at all, that those words had been meant for me, even though they made no sense, not in the life I had been living, not in the small, drafty apartment where I counted every dollar and turned down the heat at night to save on the electric bill, not in the quiet mornings when I split my pills in half to make them last just a little longer, not in any version of reality I recognized. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I said carefully, keeping my voice steady the way I always had, even when things didn't feel right. "What $5,000 are you talking about?" And just like that, something shifted between us, subtle but unmistakable, like a crack forming beneath a surface that had always seemed solid. Ryan's smile faltered, only for a second, but it was enough, his arms loosening slightly as he searched my face, as if trying to understand whether I was joking or forgetting something important, and behind him, just over his shoulder, I caught sight of Sophie standing near the dining table, her glass of champagne frozen halfway to her lips, her eyes fixed on us with an intensity that felt out of place in a room filled with laughter and warmth, the Christmas tree lights reflecting softly in her gaze, but there was no warmth in it, only something sharp, something calculating, and when our eyes met, she quickly looked away, setting her glass down a little too quickly, the faint clink against the table cutting through the music like a misplaced note. "Mom," Ryan said again, more slowly this time, lowering his voice as if the conversation had suddenly become private, "the monthly transfers, I've been sending them for over 2 years now. I wanted to make sure you were comfortable." His words came gently, but they landed heavily, each one pressing against the reality I had been living, a reality where there had been no transfers, no extra comfort, no hidden support waiting quietly in the background, only careful budgeting and silent pride, only the belief that my son was busy building his life and that I should never be a burden to him, and for a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't find a way to bridge the gap between what he believed and what I knew to be true, because if he had been sending that money, if he truly believed I had been receiving it, then there was only one question left, one that settled cold and certain in the back of my mind as I glanced once more toward Sophie, who was now pretending to laugh at something someone else had said, her posture just a little too stiff, her smile just a little too practiced, and it was a question that would not let go, no matter how much I wanted this night to remain what it had been just moments before, a simple Christmas gathering filled with family and light, because if I had never received a single dollar of that money, then someone else had, and they had been doing it for a very long time. I did not answer him right away because the room suddenly felt too bright, too loud, as if every string of lights and every burst of laughter had turned against me, exposing something I had not even known existed, and I found myself focusing on the smallest details just to stay steady, the scent of pine from the tree, the soft weight of the wool coat I had kept on because the house felt colder than I expected, the delicate clink of glasses from across the room, all of it grounding me in a moment that no longer felt simple, because there was nothing simple about what Ryan had just said, nothing simple about the idea that for 2 years, while I had been stretching every dollar, worrying over grocery receipts, and choosing between filling prescriptions or paying the heating bill during the colder months, there had supposedly been $5,000 arriving each month with my name attached to it, a sum that would have changed everything, not in a grand or extravagant way, but in the quiet ways that matter, a warmer apartment, fresh fruit without hesitation, a sense of ease instead of constant calculation, and the thought of it settled heavily in my chest, not as anger, not yet, but as something colder, something more precise. "Mom," Ryan said again, softer now, leaning closer as if he was trying to protect me from embarrassment rather than cause it, "I made sure it was automatic so you would not have to ask me for anything. I did not want you to feel like you needed to depend on me." And that was when I understood the shape of his kindness, the intention behind it, the quiet pride of a son who believed he was taking care of his mother without making her feel small, and it made what was happening now feel even more wrong, because he had done this out of love, and somewhere between his intention and my reality, that love had been redirected, intercepted, turned into something else entirely. I shook my head slowly, careful not to draw attention from the others in the room, because the last thing I wanted was a scene. Not here, not tonight. Ryan, I have never received anything like that, I said, keeping my voice calm, almost gentle, as if I was correcting a simple misunderstanding, but I could see the shift in his expression, the way his brows drew together, the way his posture straightened as if a problem had just been placed in front of him that he could not immediately solve, and that was when he reached for his phone, not dramatically, not with anger, but with the quiet efficiency I had seen him use in his work, the same steady focus that had built his success, and as he scrolled, his face began to change in ways I recognized from long ago, from moments when something did not add up, when a detail was out of place, when trust was being questioned, and I felt a strange sense of distance from it all, as if I was watching a story unfold that belonged to someone else, someone who had not spent the last 2 winters layering blankets at night, someone who had not smiled politely when friends asked how she was doing, someone who had not learned to live with less while believing that it was simply the way things were meant to be. And across the room, Sophie was still there, but she was no longer pretending to laugh. She was watching now, carefully, her gaze flickering between Ryan and me, and when Ryan finally looked up from his phone, there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, not confusion, not entirely, but the beginning of understanding, the kind that does not arrive all at once but settles in piece by piece, and in that moment, I realized that whatever had been hidden for the past 2 years was no longer safe, because the truth, once questioned, has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how carefully it has been kept out of sight. Ryan did not say anything for a long moment after that, and I could see him reading through the records on his phone, his thumb moving slower now, more deliberate, as if each line he passed carried more weight than the last, and the soft glow of the screen reflected in his eyes made him look younger for a second, like the boy who used to sit at the kitchen table doing his homework while I prepared dinner, careful, focused, trusting the world to make sense if he just looked at it closely enough. But this was not homework, and this was not something that would resolve itself neatly, because whatever he was seeing, whatever numbers and dates were lining up in front of him, they were not matching the life I had been living, and I could feel the distance between those two realities stretching wider with every second that passed. It is all here, he finally said, more to himself than to me, his voice lower now, stripped of the easy warmth it had carried before. Every month, same amount, same account, and then he looked up at me again, searching my face not for confirmation, but for truth, something steady he could hold on to, and I met his gaze without hesitation, because there was nothing for me to hide. Ryan, I have never seen that money, I said, and this time there was no softness in my voice, only certainty, the kind that comes from living something day after day without illusion, and I watched as that certainty settled into him, not comfortably, but firmly, like a piece of a puzzle that does not fit where you want it to, but fits nowhere else. And behind him, I noticed movement, Sophie stepping closer, her heels quiet against the polished floor, her expression composed in a way that might have seemed calm to anyone else, but to me, it felt practiced. Like something she had worn many times before. Is everything all right? She asked, her tone light, almost concerned, but there was a slight delay before she spoke, just enough to tell me she had been listening, just enough to make it clear that she already knew this conversation mattered. Ryan turned slightly toward her, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence without letting go of the moment between us. Mom says she has never received the transfers, he said, and I noticed he did not look at her when he said it, his attention still anchored on me, as if he was measuring the truth in real time, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered across Sophie's face, something quick and difficult to name, but not confusion, not surprise, something closer to calculation, as if she was already adjusting to a shift she had not expected to happen tonight. That is strange, she replied, a little too smoothly, her smile returning just a bit too quickly. Maybe there was a mistake with the bank. Those things happen more often than people think, and I almost admired how easily she said it, how naturally she offered an explanation that sounded reasonable on the surface, something that could have settled the matter for someone less attentive. But I had spent too many years noticing the small things, the pauses, the changes in tone, the way people filled silence when they did not want it to linger, and this felt like that, like an answer placed carefully before a question had fully formed. Ryan finally turned to look at her then, and this time, he did not smile. No, he said quietly, it is not a mistake, and there was something in his voice that made the air between them feel different, not louder, not sharper, just more defined, as if a line had been drawn that could not be ignored, and I stood there between them, not speaking, not interrupting, because I understood something in that moment that I had not understood before, that this was not going to be resolved with a quick explanation or a polite excuse, that whatever had been hidden had roots, and those roots were about to be pulled into the light, whether anyone was ready for it or not for a moment. No one moved, and the music that had once filled the room now felt distant, like it belonged to another house entirely, because all I could hear was the quiet tension settling between Ryan and Sophie, something invisible but unmistakable, and I noticed the way Ryan held his phone now, not loosely, not casually, but firmly, as if it had suddenly become something important, something that carried answers he had not been prepared to face tonight. "Show me the account," he said, his voice still calm, but there was a steadiness to it that had not been there before, a quiet insistence that did not ask for permission, and Sophie hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for me to see the shift, enough for Ryan to see it too, because he did not repeat himself, he simply waited, and that silence stretched longer than any raised voice ever could, pressing against her until she finally reached for her own phone, her movements controlled, careful, but no longer effortless, and as she scrolled, I found myself stepping slightly to the side, not to distance myself, but to see more clearly, to understand the shape of what was unfolding without being in the center of it, because something told me that this moment was not just about money, not just about numbers on a screen, but about something deeper, something that had been building quietly over time, hidden beneath ordinary days and polite conversations. "Here," Sophie said at last, turning her phone toward Ryan, and I watched as his eyes moved across the screen, slower now, more focused, and then I saw it, not the details, not the exact numbers, but the reaction, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his breath changed, subtle but real, and I knew that whatever he was looking at, it was not a simple mistake, it was not something that could be explained away with a quick apology or a technical error, because if it were, his expression would have softened, would have relaxed, but it did not, it sharpened instead, becoming something more controlled, more distant. "This is not my mother's account," he said quietly, and the words seemed to settle into the space around us, heavy and undeniable, and, for the first time, Sophie did not respond immediately, her silence stretching just long enough to confirm what neither of them had yet said out loud, that the truth was no longer something that could be managed, no longer something that could be redirected with careful words, and I felt a strange clarity in that moment, not relief, not satisfaction, but understanding, because pieces of the past began to shift in my mind, small moments that had once felt insignificant now aligning into something clearer, the times Sophie had offered to handle my mail, saying it was easier that way, the way she had insisted on setting up more efficient ways to manage things when Ryan was busy, the gentle suggestions that I did not need to worry about details anymore, that everything was being taken care of, and I had believed her, not blindly, but willingly, because it had felt easier to trust than to question, easier to accept help than to wonder what it might cost, and now, standing there, in a room filled with holiday lights and carefully arranged decorations, I realized that what had been taken was not just money, it was something quieter, something more personal, the space where trust used to live, and Ryan looked at her again, not with anger, not yet, but with something far more difficult to face, the beginning of disappointment, the kind that does not fade quickly, the kind that reshapes how you see someone, and Sophie, for the first time that evening, did not try to smile. She simply stood there, her composure still intact on the surface, but thinner now, like something that could not hold for much longer, and I remained silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood that this moment did not need my voice, the truth was already doing its work, slowly, steadily, and there was nothing left that could stop it. No one rushed to speak after that, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said so far, not because it was empty, but because it was full of things that could no longer be ignored, and I watched Ryan lower his phone slowly, his fingers tightening slightly around it as if he was holding on to something that had just shifted beyond recognition, and for a moment, I saw the exact point where trust began to break, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a thread being pulled loose from something that once felt secure. "How long?" he asked, his voice controlled, almost too controlled, the kind of calm that comes when emotions are still being processed, not yet released, and Sophie did not answer right away, her gaze moving briefly toward the people across the room, as if she was measuring how much of this moment was visible to others, how much could still be contained, and then she looked back at him, her expression carefully arranged again, but not as seamless as before. "Ryan, we should not do this here," she said softly, her tone shifting into something more private, more persuasive, but he did not move, did not lower his voice, did not step away. "How long?" he repeated, and this time, there was no softness in it, only the quiet insistence of someone who already knows the answer matters more than the setting, and I felt something settle inside me then, not fear, not even anger, but clarity, because I understood that whatever came next would not be undone, that once spoken, it would become part of the truth we all had to live with, and Sophie exhaled slowly, the smallest sign of hesitation finally breaking through her composure. "It started when you set up the account," she said, her voice even, but lower now, as if she was trying to keep it contained between the three of us. "You asked me to help organize things, remember? You were traveling, you said it would be easier if I handled the details, and I remembered that time too, vaguely, conversations I had not been part of. Decisions made with good intentions, small adjustments that had seemed harmless, and I realized how easily something like that could be redirected, how a simple act of trust could become an opening, and Ryan's eyes did not leave her face as she spoke, not once. "And you thought it was acceptable to redirect that money?" he asked, and there was something different in his voice now, not louder, not harsher, but steadier, like someone who had moved from confusion into understanding, and was now deciding what to do with it. "I did not think of it like that," Sophie replied quickly, almost too quickly. "I was managing everything, the house, the expenses, the investments, it all goes into the same system. It is not as simple as you are making it sound," and I listened to her words carefully, not for what they said, but for what they avoided, because nowhere in her explanation was there acknowledgement, nowhere was there a clear answer to the one thing that mattered, and Ryan seemed to notice that too, because he did not argue with her explanation, he simply let the silence return, and in that silence, her words began to lose their shape, their structure dissolving under the weight of what had already been revealed, and I found myself thinking back to the small moments again, the times I had felt something was slightly off but could not name it, the unopened envelopes, the gentle redirection whenever I asked about finances, the way Sophie always seemed one step ahead in conversations that involved details, and I realized that none of it had been accidental, none of it had been careless, it had been consistent, deliberate, quiet, and now, standing in the middle of a room filled with holiday decorations and distant laughter, I could see it clearly for the first time, not as a series of isolated moments, but as a pattern, one that had gone unnoticed for far too long, and Ryan closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, before opening them again, and when he did, there was no confusion left, only a calm that felt final. "We are going to fix this," he said, not to Sophie, not entirely, but to the situation itself, and I understood then that whatever came next would not be about arguments or explanations, it would be about consequences, quiet, steady, and unavoidable. Ryan did not raise his voice after that, and somehow that made everything feel more serious, more final, because he was not reacting, he was deciding, and I had seen that look before in other moments of his life, moments when he had to take control of something that could not be ignored, and he slipped his phone into his pocket with a kind of quiet precision, as if the conversation had already moved past the point of debate. "We are not discussing this here," he said calmly, glancing briefly around the room where laughter still continued, unaware, distant, untouched by what had just unfolded in our small corner of the house. "We will go to my office," and there was no question in his tone, no room for negotiation, just direction, and for the first time that evening, Sophie did not immediately respond, she simply nodded once, a small, controlled motion, but I could see the tension in her shoulders now, the effort it took to maintain the composure she had worn so easily before, and I realized that whatever confidence she had relied on until now was beginning to shift, not gone, but unsettled, and I followed them without a word, my steps steady, my hands folded lightly in front of me, not because I felt fragile, but because I felt something else entirely, something clearer than anything I had felt in a long time, as if the uncertainty that had quietly followed me for years had finally found its answer, and the hallway leading to Ryan's office felt longer than I remembered, lined with framed photographs of moments that once felt simple, vacations, birthdays, celebrations where we all stood close together, smiling in ways that now felt almost distant, as if those images belonged to a different version of us, and when we stepped into the office, the door closed softly behind us, shutting out the noise of the party, leaving only the quiet space where the truth had room to speak. Ryan moved behind his desk, not sitting down, just standing there, his posture straight, composed, while Sophie remained near the doorway for a moment before stepping further inside, as if crossing that threshold required a decision she could not undo, and I took a seat in the chair near the window, not out of weakness, but because I wanted to observe, to understand, to see everything clearly without interruption, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence settling again, but this time it felt different, more contained, more focused, like something that was about to be addressed directly. "I want the full account details," Ryan said, his voice even, "every transfer, every destination. Everything," and there was no hesitation in his request, no softness, just clarity, and Sophie exhaled slowly before responding, her voice still controlled, but thinner now. "Ryan, it is not as simple as pulling up one screen. The funds were managed within multiple accounts, investments, shared expenses," she began, but he did not interrupt, he simply listened, his expression unchanged, and when she finished, he nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Then we will go through all of it," he said, and something in that statement made it clear that this was not a conversation that would end quickly, that it would continue until every detail was accounted for, every question answered, and I sat there quietly, listening, watching, and for the first time since that question had been asked, I felt something settle inside me, not relief, not yet, but a steady sense of ground beneath my feet, because whatever had been hidden was no longer protected, and whatever came next would not depend on explanations or excuses, it would depend on facts, and facts have a way of standing on their own, no matter how long they have been kept out of sight. The room felt smaller once the door was closed, not because of its size, but because there was no longer anywhere for the truth to hide, and I watched as Sophie finally stepped closer to the desk, placing her phone down in front of Ryan as if it were something heavier than it should have been, something that carried more than just numbers and transactions, and for a moment, she did not speak, she simply stood there, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the desk, her posture still composed but no longer effortless, and Ryan did not rush her. He unlocked his computer, the soft glow of the screen illuminating his face as he began to pull up the accounts he had access to, his movements precise, familiar, the same way he handled everything that mattered, and I realized that this was no longer a conversation between husband and wife, or even between family members. It had become something else entirely, something structured, deliberate, almost clinical, as if the emotions had been set aside to make room for facts, and that shift made everything feel sharper, clearer, unavoidable. "Start from the beginning," he said quietly, his eyes still on the screen, and Sophie exhaled again, slower this time, as if she was choosing her words carefully. "When you first set up the transfers, the account was linked through the household management system," she began, her voice steady but measured. "I handled the distributions, the bills, the investments, everything was consolidated, and I listened, not interrupting, because I wanted to hear how she would explain it, how she would shape something that had already begun to reveal itself." And Ryan nodded once, still focused. "And my mother's account?" he asked, and there was a pause, brief but undeniable. "It was never directly linked," Sophie admitted, and the words seemed to settle into the room with a quiet weight, and I felt something inside me shift again, not surprise, not anymore, but confirmation, because what had once been a question was now becoming a pattern, something that could be traced, something that could be understood in full. "So where did the money go?" Ryan asked, and this time, he looked at her directly, not with anger, but with clarity, the kind that does not allow for vague answers or careful deflection, and Sophie held his gaze for a second before looking down at the phone, her fingers brushing lightly against the screen. "It was allocated," she said, choosing the word with care, "to shared assets, to accounts under my management. It was not separated the way you are thinking," and I noticed how she framed it, how she avoided saying exactly what had happened, replacing it with terms that sounded organized, reasonable, almost justified. But Ryan did not respond to the language, he responded to the facts. "You redirected the funds," he said, and there was no question in his voice, only a statement, and Sophie did not correct him this time. She did not offer a softer version or a different explanation, she simply remained still, and that stillness said more than any words could have, because silence, when it comes after clarity, is its own kind of answer. And I sat there quietly, my hands resting in my lap, feeling the weight of what had just been confirmed, not just the loss of money, but the realization that something so simple, so meaningful, had been quietly taken and reshaped without my knowledge. And yet, I did not feel the need to speak, because everything that needed to be said was already unfolding in front of me, piece by piece, and Ryan leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged, but there was something final in the way he exhaled, as if a line had been crossed that could not be undone, and in that moment, I understood that this was no longer about discovering the truth, it was about what would be done with it, and that decision was already beginning to take shape. Ryan did not react immediately after that admission, and the silence that followed felt deliberate, as if he was allowing the weight of her words to settle fully before deciding what came next, and I watched him turn slightly toward his desk, opening a drawer with the same controlled precision he had shown all evening. Pulling out a thin folder that looked untouched, its edges clean, its surface smooth, and for a brief moment, I wondered how long it had been sitting there, waiting for a moment like this. "I want you to listen carefully," he said, his voice calm but no longer distant, now carrying a quiet authority that filled the room without effort, and Sophie straightened slightly, her expression tightening just enough to reveal that she understood something had shifted again, something she could not easily redirect, and he placed the folder on the desk, opening it slowly, revealing documents neatly arranged inside. 2 months ago, my financial advisor flagged irregularities, he continued, his tone steady, measured, patterns that did not align with the way I structured these transfers, and I felt a subtle change in the air, not surprise exactly, but something close to it, because this was no longer a reaction to discovery, it was confirmation of something that had already begun before tonight, something that had been quietly investigated, piece by piece. I did not say anything at the time, Ryan went on, glancing briefly at me before returning his focus to Sophie, because I wanted to understand the full picture first, and I realized then that this moment, this confrontation, had not been entirely accidental, that the question he had asked earlier had not come from nowhere, but from a place of growing awareness, and Sophie remained still, her composure holding, but thinner now, more fragile, as if it required effort to maintain. "The transfers were meant for one account," he said, tapping lightly on one of the documents, "but they were routed through 3 separate channels before ending up under your management," and there was no accusation in his voice, only clarity, the kind that leaves no space for denial, and I watched as Sophie's gaze shifted briefly toward the papers, then back to him, her silence stretching longer this time, not strategic, but unavoidable. "I consolidated the accounts to improve efficiency," she said finally, her voice quieter, less certain, and for the first time, it did not sound like an explanation, it sounded like something she was holding on to, something that no longer carried the same weight it once did, and Ryan nodded once, acknowledging her words without accepting them. "Efficiency does not explain why my mother never received a single payment," he replied, and the room seemed to hold that sentence in place, letting it settle without interruption, and I sat there, listening, feeling the clarity of it all take shape in a way that no longer required interpretation, because the facts were no longer hidden behind assumptions or misunderstandings, they were laid out, structured, undeniable, and for the first time since the evening had begun, I felt something unexpected, not relief, not yet, but a quiet sense of alignment, as if the truth, once scattered and unclear, had finally found its place, and Ryan closed the folder gently, his expression unchanged, but his posture firm, resolved. "This is not a misunderstanding," he said, his voice steady, final, and in that moment, I understood that whatever came next would not be about uncovering what had happened, it would be about what would be done with what had already been proven. Ryan did not speak immediately after that, and the quiet in the room felt settled now, no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but complete, as if everything that needed to be understood had already been placed on the table, and what remained was not discovery, but decision, and I watched him rest his hand lightly on the closed folder, his posture steady, his expression calm in a way that felt different from before, not restrained, but resolved. "You will transfer every dollar back," he said, his voice even, not raised, not harsh, but absolute in a way that left no room for interpretation, and Sophie did not respond right away, her gaze fixed on the edge of the desk, her composure still present but thinner now, like something that had reached its limit, and for the first time that evening, she did not try to explain, did not offer another version of events, she simply stood there, and in that silence, I understood that she knew the same thing we did, that there was no version of this that could be reshaped into something acceptable, no explanation that could undo what had already been done. "There will be a full accounting," Ryan continued, his tone unchanged, "every transaction, every account, everything will be reviewed," and there was something final in the way he said it, not as a threat, not as a reaction, but as a step already decided, already set in motion, and I remained seated, my hands resting quietly in my lap, listening, not because I needed to hear more, but because I wanted to witness it fully, to understand how something that had once been invisible had now become undeniable. And Sophie finally lifted her head, her expression composed once again, but different now, not controlled, not calculated, but quieter, as if something within her had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. "I understand," she said softly, and the words carried no resistance, no argument, only acknowledgement, and Ryan nodded once, not in approval, but in acceptance of what would follow, and then he turned slightly toward me, his expression softening just enough to reveal something else beneath the control, something personal, something that had been there all along but had been overshadowed by everything else. "Mom," he said, and there was a weight in that single word, something that held both regret and clarity, and I met his gaze without hesitation, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to doubt. "It is all right," I said, my voice steady, not because it was simple, not because it was easy, but because the truth had already done what it needed to do. It had removed the uncertainty, the quiet doubt that had lingered for too long, and in its place, it had left something clearer, something stronger, and I rose slowly from the chair, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, and as I walked toward the door, I paused for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the handle, feeling the stillness of the room behind me, the weight of everything that had been said, everything that had been uncovered, and I realized then that I did not feel anger, not in the way I might have expected. I felt something else entirely, something quieter, something steadier, the understanding that what had been taken was now visible, that what had been hidden was now known, and that nothing built on silence could remain once the truth had found its voice. And without looking back, I opened the door and stepped out into the soft glow of the Christmas lights, the sound of distant laughter returning as if nothing had changed, but I knew better, because everything had, and I no longer needed to say anything more. The truth had already spoken for me.